Marcus, a man in his 40s, was a respected taxi driver in his town, but his reputation wasn't solely linked to his professionalism. He was also known for the strange and mysterious tales he loved to share with his passengers, though he was never ready to believe them himself. The most superstitious whispered that he had a particular connection with the invisible forces of the night. But for Marcus, these were just stories. After all, he spent his days and nights driving through the deserted streets of the city, far from curious eyes. It was a calm night. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the stars struggled to pierce through the darkness. The sound of his engine was the only noise breaking the silence in this market district. Marcus drove at a leisurely pace, his thoughts wandering. He loved these solitary hours when the city was asleep and only the sounds of nature or his engine kept him company. It was during these moments that the isolation of the road allowed him to reflect on his life, the choices he had made, and what he believed to be a peaceful existence, far from any mysticism or supernatural events. But that evening, something was about to shatter his vision of things. As he approached the market, a female silhouette appeared on the side of the road. There was nothing unusual about that. People sometimes had to go into town to buy food or supplies. But what intrigued Marcus was the way she stood there. Slowing down, Marcus wondered if this person really needed a taxi. But before he could make a move, another silhouette appeared, then a third. There they were, all three of them, planted like statues on the sidewalk without any movement, waiting silently. Marcus stopped beside them. One of the women, the one standing in the center, raised her hand in a graceful gesture. She had a strange beauty, almost unreal, and her gaze was deep and penetrating. She spoke in a soft but determined voice, "Good evening, driver. We need you to take us to a rather distant neighborhood." Marcus, though surprised by their strange appearance, agreed without asking questions. The taxi business was made for accepting passengers of all types, and he had never refused a fare. He smiled and replied, "Very well, ladies, get in. Where should we go?" The three women got into the taxi in silence. Each settled into a different seat, and there was no exchange of words between them. They seemed to have some sort of tacit understanding, and this made Marcus a bit nervous. The women didn't seem to want to talk, and Marcus didn't insist. He drove slowly through the familiar streets of the city, then headed toward a darker, even emptier road. The journey, banal at first, began to take a strange turn. The road seemed increasingly deserted. The light from the street lamps gradually faded. Buildings became scarce, and soon there was no more light on the horizon. A light mist began to rise, invading the road, making driving even more difficult. The silence was total. Even the radio, which normally broadcast light music, emitted a strange buzzing. Marcus looked at his passengers in the rear-view mirror. They were still as motionless, their faces barely visible in the shadow of the car. As he drove, he noticed that the streets were becoming increasingly strange. The landscape, once quite familiar, seemed to have transformed. Time seemed suspended, frozen. Marcus, trying to dispel his unease, turned his head toward the women and asked them, "Please, ladies, where exactly are you going? We're no longer in the neighborhood you described to me." The oldest of the women, the one sitting near him, turned her head slightly toward him without a word. Her voice, almost inaudible, murmured, "We're going home. The neighborhood isn't far." Marcus didn't insist further, but deep down, an intuition was born: something wasn't right. This road, these women, this strange landscape, all of it seemed unreal to him, almost unrealistically disconnected from what he knew. He continued driving, his mind invaded by a worry he couldn't explain. What he didn't know yet was that he was about to be drawn into an adventure far more terrifying than anything he had ever imagined. The further he went, the more uneasy he felt, a sensation of discomfort growing in his stomach. He cast furtive glances in the rearview mirror where the pale faces of the three women stared at him without emotion. They were motionless, their eyes shining in the half-light, and all he could hear was the regular sound of their breathing. Nothing else. Not a word, not a sound. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, he spotted a strange silhouette in the distance in the night. White tombstones began to appear on the horizon, one by one, like specters rising from the earth. Marcus's heart tightened in his chest. The landscape had radically changed. Where he expected to see houses, there were only graves. A sea of tombstones stretching as far as the eye could see. Marcus slowed down, the car's headlights sweeping across the tombstones illuminated by the cold glow of the mist. He parked slowly, his sweaty hands gripping the steering wheel. He turned toward the women, trying to understand what was happening. There was no longer any trace of life here. No sound, only graves. He asked, his voice trembling with worry, "But where am I? This isn't a neighborhood, it's a cemetery." No response, not a movement. The women remained there, motionless like statues, without changing expression. Marcus felt fear, not his guts. He looked at them in the rearview mirror, eyes wide, seeking an explanation. Then the youngest of the women slowly raised her eyes to him and replied in an almost inaudible whisper, "We live here, driver. These are our homes." These words resonated in the cold night air, amplified by the silence around them. Marcus blinked, incredulous. Live here? How could they live in such a gloomy place, surrounded by tombstones? Something was wrong, something he couldn't grasp. He turned his gaze toward the road, and that's when he noticed something terrifying. The graves seemed to be getting closer, as if they were moving toward him. An icy shiver ran through his body. His eyes fixed on the tombstones around him that appeared to be rising higher, closer, as if seeking to engulf him. He quickly turned his gaze toward the women, but what he saw then made him jump. The three silhouettes that had been sitting quietly in the car had just disappeared. The seats were now empty. In a moment of pure horror, Marcus felt his heart stop. Where had they gone? What were they? He turned abruptly toward the back seat. Nothing. He searched frantically for them with his gaze. His mind was drowning in panic. Then, as if by magic, an icy wind blew through the car, making the headlights flicker. It was there, in that mist, that he saw them again. They were standing in front of the car, but this time, they no longer seemed human. Marcus let out a muffled cry, his survival instinct taking over. He turned the ignition key in a flash and pressed the accelerator, launching the car forward. But nothing happened. The car was as if paralyzed, nailed to the ground. He then turned his head, and there he understood. The cemetery, the graves, the women, all of it seemed to be closing in on him as if the entire place had been a gigantic spider's web and he was the prey. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. Fear seized him. He had no choice. He couldn't stay there. Without thinking further, Marcus jumped out of the car. He ran, his heart pounding, his breathing ragged. He crossed through the graves, stumbling, slipping, but he didn't stop running. He heard noises behind him, sounds that seemed to be approaching, whispers in the mist. The women, or what they had become, were following him. Marcus ran without looking back until his legs gave out. He had no more breath, no more energy, for what seemed like hours until he reached an isolated house at the end of the path. His body exhausted and his mind in the grip of absolute terror, he let himself fall to his knees in front of the door, his chest heaving violently with each breath. Marcus spent several hours in the house, huddled in a corner, trembling, his eyes wide open, fixed on nothing. Anguish prevented him from moving. He had managed to flee, to escape the horror of the cemetery, but he knew deep down that this was only the beginning of his ordeal. He tried to open his mouth, but no sound came out. He wanted to scream, call for help, but there was nothing but silence. The entire village seemed to have noticed his strange behavior, his transformation into a man frozen in paralyzing terror. Rumors began to circulate. Neighbors worried, whispering that he had been struck by an evil spell, that he had seen something no human being should see. The feeling of despair grew in the family. Marcus was still there, mute, frozen, like a man living in a world that wasn't his own. The days passed slowly. Marcus's condition only worsened. His body seemed weak, lifeless, but his eyes, always wide open, never stopped staring at an imaginary point as if he were watching a film that no one else could see. He was nothing more than an empty shell, a man caught in a torment that no prayer, no force seemed able to relieve. The mystery surrounding him, the disappeared women, the cemetery, the terror he had felt in the night, all of it was closing in on him like an invisible trap with no way out, and a feeling of terror grew in the air, as if, in this heavy silence, death itself was waiting, ready to make its final move. The days followed one another in an icy torpor. Marcus, still frozen, remained there in the same posture, motionless. His wide-open eyes, filled with indescribable terror, no longer blinked. His body, once robust and full of life, had become a collapsed silhouette, a shadow of a man who was nothing more than the shadow of himself. The cries of his loved ones, the prayers, the healing attempts by pastors and imams, all of it had remained without effect. Nothing had been able to break the grip of this strange curse, this invisible evil that had engulfed him. Marcus no longer ate, he no longer drank. His lips were dry, his body pale as if slowly decomposing from within. His mind, meanwhile, seemed to be locked in a prison of terror with no way out. He had no more will, no more strength. He was nothing more than a body in suspension, a soul imprisoned in an endless nightmare. The house, once filled with life, had become a gloomy place, a place where the whispers of neighbors mingled with endless prayers. The village people began to avoid the house, terrified by what was happening inside. The children who once played around no longer dared to approach. Marcus's name had become synonymous with curse. A warning for those who would dare to look too much into the darkness. The desperate family called once again for a traditional healer. He arrived, dressed in his traditional garb, carrying herbs and potions supposed to ward off evil spirits. But faced with Marcus's condition, he understood that this was not an evil he could cure with his remedies. He remained silent for a moment, observing the man like an animal in a cage, a creature frozen in eternal terror. Then he murmured ancient words, incantations he had learned from his ancestors. But once again, there was no reaction. Marcus still didn't move. It was in this slow agony that the fatal day arrived. It was late in the afternoon, a pale light filtering through the dusty windows of the house. The family, overwhelmed by the situation, stood around him silently. Pain, despair, and exhaustion could be read on their faces. No one dared say the word they were all thinking, death. But at that moment, they all knew the end was near. Marcus no longer had the strength to fight against what had invaded him. Night fell, and with it, Marcus's end arrived. Without a sound, he let out his last breath. It wasn't a cry or a moan, just a breath like a light wind dying out, carried away by the breeze. His eyes, which had remained open since that terrible evening when he had seen the women disappear, slowly closed. It wasn't a peaceful sleep. It was the end of an unexplained suffering, of a silent agony that had gnawed at him from within. He never spoke of what he had seen, nor of what he had lived through in that cemetery. He didn't have the opportunity to tell his story, to share his last words. But the whispers of the village continued to spread. They said that Marcus had seen the darkness, that his soul had been taken by something much older than the world itself, a force he should never have encountered. The village inhabitants remained marked by what he had lived through. The children, though curious, never dared ask questions about the taxi driver's story. The adults remembered it as a warning. One night, he was just a man among many others, and the next day he had become a myth, a legend, a terrifying legend that reminded everyone that certain things, certain places are meant to stay in the shadows, where darkness waits patiently. The cemetery itself remained intact. The tombstones were still there, like silent witnesses of a past that the world should not discover. And some, in the mist of moonless nights, still whispered his name, Marcus, the taxi driver who had seen the invisible and who, ultimately, never returned from it. Thus ended the story of Marcus, a story forgotten and found again in the whispers of darkness, where reality blends with the supernatural. The moral lesson of this story is that certain things escape our understanding and that curiosity can sometimes lead us down dangerous paths. It is essential to respect the mysteries and invisible forces that surround us, because certain secrets, even if they attract us, are better left untouched. Inner peace comes from accepting our limits and respecting what is beyond our control.